The security footage would later show the exact moment at 11:47 p.m. when everything changed. A man in a thin janitor's uniform kneeling in 6 inches of fresh snow outside the downtown office tower, wrapping his only winter coat around a shivering child huddled against the building's heating vent. What the cameras couldn't capture was the sound of the boy's teeth chattering, or the way the man's hand shook as he pulled the coat tight and zipped it to the child's chin. His name was David Chen, 32 years old, finishing the night shift that ended at midnight. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees, and the wind off Lake Michigan cut through his uniform shirt like broken glass. The boy couldn't have been more than 6, wearing summer clothes and no shoes. His lips had gone purple. David didn't think. He never did in moments like this. 6 months ago, he'd lost his daughter Emma to pneumonia because he'd waited too long to take her to the emergency room, trying to make it through one more night without the cost of urgent care. She'd been 7 years old. This boy was younger. "Here, buddy, take this. It's warm." David's voice came out gentle, the same tone he'd used reading bedtime stories. The boy stared at him with huge dark eyes, not speaking, not moving. David wrapped the coat around thin shoulders and stood up. "Stay here by the vent. Someone will find you in the morning." He walked away before he could change his mind. The coat had cost him 2 weeks of grocery money 3 winters ago. It was the only thing between him and the cold during his walks home. But Emma's face kept appearing in his mind, the way she'd looked that last morning, struggling to breathe. The shift supervisor, Glenn Morrison, was waiting by the service entrance when David came back inside. Glenn's eyes went straight to David's bare arms, then to the snow melting in his hair. "Where's your coat, Chen?" "Left it at home." The lie came automatically. David grabbed his cleaning cart and headed for the executive offices on the 42nd floor. His teeth were chattering now, body trying to generate heat it couldn't spare. Glenn followed him to the elevator. "You walk here in 18-degree weather with no coat." "Forgot it. You're a terrible liar." Glenn crossed his arms. "I saw the footage. You gave your coat to some kid outside." David's stomach dropped. The building had cameras everywhere, monitoring every angle, every entrance. He'd forgotten about them. He was freezing. That kid was probably bait. You know how these scams work. Someone's parent puts them out there to look pathetic, then they rob whoever stops to help. You're lucky you only lost a coat. He was a child. He was bait, Glenn repeated. And now you're on camera making physical contact with a minor, wrapping your coat around him, touching him. Do you have any idea how that looks? The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor. David pushed his cat out, pulse hammering. "I was helping him." "That's not how the lawyers will see it." Glenn stepped into the hallway, blocking David's path to the offices. "I'm writing you up. You made physical contact with an unaccompanied minor on company property. That's grounds for immediate termination." "Company property?" David stared at him. He was on the street, a public sidewalk. "The sidewalk is part of our lease. Building management is responsible for everything within 50 feet of the entrance, which means that interaction happened on our property, and you're our employee." Glenn pulled out his phone. "I'm calling it in now. You're suspended pending investigation." David felt the air leave his lungs. Suspended meant no paycheck. No paycheck meant no rent, no food, no way to keep his son warm. 5-year-old Nathan was home right now with Mrs. Park from downstairs, who watched him during David's night shifts in exchange for help with her bills. "Glenn, please. I need this job. You should have thought of that before you touched that kid." Glenn was already dialing. "Security will escort you out. Leave your badge and keys." The executive offices stretched out behind Glenn, floor-to-ceiling windows showing the city lights and the lake beyond. David had cleaned these offices for 3 years, scrubbing toilets and emptying trash cans for people who made more in an hour than he made in a month. He'd never complained. He'd never been late. He'd never caused problems. He'd just given his coat to a freezing child. "I have a son," David heard himself say. "He's 5. If I lose this job, we'll lose our apartment." Glenn's expression didn't change. Should have considered that before breaking protocol. The security guards arrived within minutes. They were polite, almost apologetic, as they walked David to the service elevator and rode down with him in silence. One of them had worked the building as long as David had. They'd shared coffee sometimes during breaks. "Sorry, man," the guard muttered as they reached the ground floor. "Rules are rules." David handed over his badge and keys. The guards walked him to the entrance and held the door open. The snow was coming down harder now, wind driving it sideways across the empty street. Without his coat, the cold hit him like a physical blow. He started walking. 43 blocks to the apartment he shared with Nathan, through neighborhoods that got worse the farther you went from downtown. His fingers went numb first, then his ears, then his face. By block 15, he'd stopped shivering. That was a bad sign. He'd read somewhere that when your body stopped shivering, it meant hypothermia was setting in. But he kept walking because Nathan was waiting, because Mrs. Park needed to get back to her own apartment, because stopping meant freezing and freezing meant dying, and Nathan had already lost his mother to a car accident 2 years ago. He couldn't lose his father too. David didn't notice the black car following 3 blocks behind him, or the way it slowed when he stumbled at block 27. He didn't see the driver make a phone call, or the way the car stayed with him all the way to his building. He made it home at 1:15 a.m., fingers too numb to work his keys. Mrs. Park had to let him in. She took one look at him and gasped. "Mr. Chen, you're blue." "I'm fine." His voice came out slurred. "Thank you for watching, Nathan." Mrs. Park helped him inside, got him under blankets, made him tea he couldn't hold without spilling. Nathan woke up and came padding into the living room in his dinosaur pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "Daddy, you're home early." "Yeah, buddy, come here." Nathan climbed onto the couch and curled against David's chest. He was warm, solid, alive. David held him and tried not to think about the job he'd just lost, or the rent due in 5 days, or the fact that he'd committed professional suicide for a child he'd never see again. What he didn't know was that 42 floors above the city, in an office with windows facing the lake, someone was reviewing security footage from the front entrance. Watching it again and again, the same 30-second clip on an endless loop. The man in the uniform taking off his coat. The gentle way he knelt in the snow. The care with which he wrapped the coat around small shoulders. The viewer sat in darkness, the only light coming from the monitor screen. His name was James Mitchell, 58 years old, CEO of Mitchell Properties and owner of the building where David Chen had just been fired. He watched the footage 17 times before finally sitting back in his leather chair. His hands were. 20 years ago, James Mitchell had a son named Ryan. The boy had been 6 years old, curious and fearless and loved beyond measure. One winter night, Ryan had wandered away from their vacation home in Aspen. They'd found him 3 hours later, frozen to death in a snowbank less than a mile from the house. James had spent 20 years building an empire, making billions, using money to fill the hole his son's death had left. He'd told himself that success was the answer, that power and wealth could make him forget the sound of Ryan's laugh or the weight of his small body in James's arms. He'd been lying to himself for 2 decades. On the monitor screen, the janitor stood up and walked away, leaving the boy wrapped in warmth. The boy's face was visible in the frame for just a moment, illuminated by the building's exterior lights. He looked exactly like Ryan. James Mitchell picked up his phone and made a call. "I need everything you can find on David Chen. Night shift maintenance. Employment records, address, family situation. I want it in an hour." He hung up and went back to watching the footage. The janitor disappeared into the building at timestamp 11:48 p.m. The boy stayed huddled by the heating vent, wrapped in the coat. At 11:52, a police car pulled up and 2 officers got out. They approached the boy carefully, talked to him, finally convinced him to get in the car. At 11:53, the boy turned back toward the building one last time before the officers helped him into the vehicle. The coat was still wrapped around him, several sizes too large, the sleeves hanging past his hands. James paused the footage on that final frame. The boy's face in profile, looking back at the place where a stranger had shown him kindness. Looking back at the building James Mitchell owned, where he'd just allowed a good man to be fired for doing the right thing. He sat in the dark office until dawn, watching the city wake up 42 floors below, and tried to remember the last time he'd done something that mattered. The last time he'd helped someone who couldn't help him back. The last time he'd been anything other than rich and empty and alone. At 6 a.m., his assistant arrived with the file on David Chen. James read it twice, memorizing every detail. Single father. One son, age 5. Wife deceased. 3 years of perfect employment records. No complaints, no issues, no problems until last night. Suspended for inappropriate contact with a minor. James Mitchell had made his fortune by being ruthless, by seeing opportunities others missed, by never letting emotion cloud his judgment. But looking at David Chen's file, looking at the photo of a tired man in a janitor's uniform, all he could think about was his son Ryan and the stranger who'd cared enough to help a freezing child when no one else had stopped. Glenn Morrison's report was attached to the file. James read it, then picked up his phone again. Get me Glenn Morrison. I don't care if it's his day off. I want him in my office in 1 hour. He hung up and looked at the security footage one more time. The janitor walking away into the snow, shoulders hunched against the cold, leaving his only coat with a child who needed it more. The question that would haunt James Mitchell wasn't whether David Chen had done the right thing. It was whether James could do the right thing now, whether he could use his power and wealth for something other than building an empire that meant nothing, whether he could save the man who'd saved a child that looked like Ryan. At around word 600, David sat in his apartment as dawn light crept through the thin curtains, holding Nathan close and trying not to let his son see how scared he was. The suspension meant he couldn't work, couldn't provide, couldn't protect the only family he had left. He felt utterly alone in that moment, isolated by circumstances and a system that punished kindness. If you're watching this story unfold, wherever you are in the world right now, leave a comment and let me know your location. Sometimes when we're at our lowest points, it helps to know we're not alone, that somewhere people are listening and caring about what happens next. David couldn't have known it then, but he wasn't as alone as he felt. Outside his window, the black car that had followed him home was still parked across the street. 9 months ago, David Chen's life had been completely different. He'd been a daytime maintenance supervisor at a medical facility, making enough to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood. Nathan had been in a good preschool. They'd had health insurance, savings, a reliable car. Not wealthy, but stable, safe. Then the facility closed, bought out by a larger hospital system that brought in their own maintenance staff. David got a severance package that lasted exactly 6 weeks before the bills ate through it. The night janitor position at Mitchell Properties paid $9 an hour, $3 less than his old job, and came with no benefits. He'd taken it anyway because Nathan needed to eat. The apartment they lived in now was technically a studio that the landlord had illegally divided with drywall. Nathan slept on a mattress on the floor in the smaller section. David slept on a couch someone had left on the curb 3 years ago. The heating barely worked. The bathroom faucet leaked constantly, adding $15 to the water bill every month that David couldn't afford but couldn't fix without tools he didn't have. Mrs. Park from downstairs watched Nathan during David's night shifts because she was lonely and kind and needed help with her own bills. David fixed things in her apartment when they broke, helped her carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs, shoveled the front walk in winter. It wasn't a formal arrangement. It was survival. Nathan didn't understand why they'd moved, why his room was so small now, why Daddy was always tired. He'd stopped asking questions after the first month, which broke David's heart more than anything else. 5-year-olds were supposed to ask endless questions. The fact that Nathan had learned not to meant he'd already figured out that Daddy didn't have good answers. Before Emma died, David had been married to a woman named Lisa. They'd met in community college, fell in love over shared shifts at a coffee shop, got married at City Hall because neither of them had money for a real wedding. Lisa had been practical, funny, endlessly optimistic even when their bank account hit 0. She died when Nathan was 3, hit by a drunk driver while walking home from a shift at the grocery store. The driver had been the son of a city councilman. He'd gotten 6 months and served 3. David had fallen apart for exactly 2 weeks, then pulled himself together because Emma and Nathan needed him. He'd learned to braid Emma's hair, pack school lunches, help with homework, be both mother and father. He'd been doing okay until the pneumonia. Emma had complained of a cough on Monday. By Wednesday, she had a fever. David gave her children's medicine and told her to rest because the urgent care clinic cost $200 and they didn't have it. By Friday morning, she couldn't breathe right. He'd rushed her to the emergency room, but they'd had to wait 3 hours because they couldn't prove they could pay. When they finally saw her, the infection had spread to both lungs. She died on Sunday. The medical bills totaled $63,000. David was still paying them at $25 a month, which was all the hospital would accept without sending collections after him. At that rate, he'd be paying until Nathan graduated college. If Nathan ever got to go to college. Now the suspension meant David couldn't even make those minimal payments. It meant the rent due in 5 days wouldn't get paid. It meant Nathan's preschool tuition was impossible. It meant they'd be homeless within weeks. On Tuesday morning, 3 days after the incident, David called Glenn Morrison to plead his case. Glenn's response was clinical and final. The investigation is ongoing. You made physical contact with an unaccompanied minor. That's policy violation level 3. Even if you're cleared, you're looking at mandatory retraining and probation. More likely, you're terminated. Glenn, I gave a kid my coat. That's it. That's all I did. You touched him. You put your coat on him. You zipped it up. That's multiple points of physical contact with a minor who can't consent. Do you understand how serious this is? David understood that he was being destroyed for showing kindness. He understood that the system was designed to protect the company, not the people who kept it running. He understood that no one cared whether he'd helped a freezing child because helping wasn't in the employee handbook. I have a son, David said quietly. He's 5 years old. We'll lose our apartment. That's not my problem. Glenn hung up. By Wednesday, word had spread. David didn't know how it always happened, but somehow everyone in his building knew he'd been suspended from his job. The way neighbors looked at him changed. Mrs. Park still watched Nathan, but she'd started asking when he'd be back at work, an edge of worry in her voice. Thursday morning, David went to the building where he'd worked, hoping to talk to someone higher up than Glenn. The security guards wouldn't let him pass the lobby. Sir, you're suspended. You're not allowed on the property. I need to speak to human resources. You can call them. The guard, the same one who'd apologize while escorting David out, wouldn't meet his eyes. David called. He got voicemail. He left 3 messages. No one called back. On Friday, the rent was due. David had $140 in his bank account. The rent was $950. He went to the landlord's office, a converted storefront 3 blocks away, and tried to explain. The landlord, a man named Frank who'd inherited the building from his father and ran it like a personal fiefdom, didn't let him finish. You got the rent or not? I can pay part of it. $200 now, the rest when I get back to work. When's that? I don't know. There's an investigation. Frank leaned back in his chair, studying David like something stuck to his shoe. Investigation for what? David explained about the coat, the child, the suspension. Frank's expression shifted from annoyance to something wise. So you're under investigation for messing with a kid? No, I helped a kid who was freezing. That's it. That's not what it sounds like to me. Frank stood up. I got families in this building. I can't have someone like you around kids. Someone like me. David felt his face go hot. I'm a good father. I've never hurt anyone. Yeah, well, you're also a guy under investigation for inappropriate contact with a minor. What am I supposed to think? Frank opened the office door. You got until Monday to come up with a full rent or you're out. And even if you pay, I want you gone by the end of the month. I'll give you a week's notice in writing. David stood there, speechless. It was happening too fast, the walls closing in from every direction at once. He'd tried to help a child and now he was losing everything. Frank, please. I have a son. Then you better figure out where you're gonna take him, because it ain't gonna be my building. Frank pointed to the door. Get out. David walked home in a daze. Nathan was at preschool, one of the few places that hadn't heard about the suspension yet. Mrs. Park was at a doctor's appointment. The apartment was empty and cold and felt like a tomb. He sat on the couch and put his face in his hands. The medical bills from Emma's death were stacked on the kitchen counter, each one a reminder of how he'd failed her. The eviction notice would arrive by Monday. Nathan would have to leave his preschool. They'd have nowhere to go. David had family back in California, his parents and his sister, but they cut him off when he married Lisa. Something about her not being good enough, not Chinese enough, not fitting their expectations. They'd never met Emma or Nathan. When Lisa died, his mother had sent a card that said, "I'm sorry for your loss," like she was writing to a stranger. He had friends from high school, from college, but poverty had a way of making those connections fade. People got uncomfortable when you couldn't afford to split the check at dinner, couldn't go to the movies, couldn't do anything that cost money. Eventually, they stopped calling. David was utterly alone. That night, Nathan asked why they were having cereal for dinner again. David said he wasn't very hungry. Would Nathan like the rest of Daddy's bowl? Nathan said yes and ate both servings while David watched and tried not to let him see how empty the cupboards were behind them. Sunday morning, David woke up with chest pains. Sharp, stabbing sensations that made it hard to breathe. He'd felt them before, stress-related, nothing serious, but they were worse now. He took Nathan to the park because it was free and they needed to get out of the apartment. Nathan played on the swings while David sat on a bench and tried to figure out what to do. Apply for welfare, except that took weeks to process. Find another job, except who would hire someone under investigation for child-related misconduct. Move to a shelter, except the family shelters had months-long waiting lists and Nathan would have to change schools. There was no good option. There was no option at all. That's when his phone rang. Unknown number. Mr. Chen, this is Patricia Grayson from Mitchell Properties Human Resources. We need to speak with you about your suspension. Can you come to the office Monday at 9 a.m.? David's heart stopped. Monday was eviction day. Monday was the day everything ended. But maybe, somehow, this was a chance. Yes, I'll be there. Good. Please be on time. This meeting will determine your employment status. She hung up before David could ask any questions. He sat on the park bench, watching Nathan push himself higher on the swings, and tried to feel hopeful. But all he could think about was the way Glenn had said inappropriate contact with a minor like David was some kind of predator. The way Frank had looked at him like he was contaminated. The way the entire system had decided that helping a freezing child was grounds for destruction. At around word 800 in this nightmare, David found himself wondering if anyone out there understood what it was like to do the right thing and be punished for it. The isolation was crushing, the feeling that he was alone against forces he couldn't fight. But isolation is a lie we tell ourselves when we're drowning. Sometimes the act of sharing a story, of letting others witness what's happening, can shift something fundamental in the universe. If this story is reaching you, if you're hearing David's struggle and feeling even a fraction of his desperation, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next, because David's story isn't over yet and he needs people to care about what comes next. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story about resilience, about what happens when ordinary people face impossible choices. Check the description below for resources about supporting families in crisis, about changing systems that punish kindness, about making sure this doesn't happen to the next person who tries to help. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is witness each other's stories and say, "You're not alone. We see you. This matters." David couldn't have known it yet, but people were watching, people were listening, people were about to change everything. Monday morning arrived too fast. David dressed in his only dress pants and a button-down shirt he'd bought at Goodwill. He walked Nathan to Mrs. Park's apartment at 8 a.m. and tried not to let his son see how scared he was. "Daddy has a meeting. I'll be back soon." "Okay." Nathan hugged him. "Good luck, Daddy." David held on maybe a second too long, breathing in the smell of his son's shampoo, trying to memorize this moment. Then he let go and walked to the bus stop because he'd sold his car 2 months ago to pay the electric bill. The bus ride downtown took 40 minutes. David watched the city change through the windows, neighborhoods getting wealthier the closer they got to the lake. By the time he reached Mitchell Properties, he was entering a world where people paid more for coffee than he'd spent on groceries that week. The lobby was marble and glass, soaring ceilings, and abstract art that probably cost more than David's yearly salary. The security guard who checked him in was new, didn't recognize him, treated him with a polite indifference reserved for people who clearly didn't belong. 9th floor. Human Resources. David took the elevator up, watching the floor numbers climb, each one feeling like a countdown to the end. The doors opened onto a carpeted hallway with frosted glass doors and modern furniture. A receptionist directed him to a conference room at the end of the hall. "Ms. Grayson will be with you shortly." David sat in the conference room and waited. The chair was more comfortable than his couch at home. The table was real wood, polished to a mirror shine. There was artwork on the walls, tasteful landscapes that probably cost more than Nathan's entire preschool tuition. This was the world that had decided David was a problem to be eliminated. The door opened. A woman in her 50s entered, carrying a file folder. She sat across from David, her expression neutral and professional. "Mr. Chen, I'm Patricia Grayson, Senior Director of Human Resources. I've reviewed your case extensively. I need to be clear with you about the severity of the situation." David nodded, not trusting his voice. "You made physical contact with an unaccompanied minor on company property. You put your hands on a child. You removed your coat and placed it on his body. You zipped the coat up to his neck. All of this was captured on security footage. I was helping him. He was freezing. That's not a determination you're authorized to make. If you'd seen a child in distress, the appropriate response would have been to call security or the police. Instead, you personally intervened and made repeated physical contact. This violates our policy on interaction with minors." "Your policy on interaction with minors." David heard his voice rising. He was dying of cold. What was I supposed to do? Let him freeze while I called someone? Patricia's expression didn't change. "Policy exists for a reason, Mr. Chen. We can't have employees making physical contact with children. The liability exposure is enormous. What if the child had accused you of inappropriate touching? What if his parents had sued?" "He didn't have parents. He was homeless. You don't know that. You made assumptions and acted on them without following protocol." Patricia opened the file. "Your employment with Mitchell Properties is terminated, effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks of severance pay, which is more generous than the contract requires given the nature of your violation." 2 weeks of severance. That was $700, barely enough to cover half of 1 month's rent somewhere cheaper than his current apartment, which he was losing anyway. "Please." David heard himself begging and couldn't stop. "I need this job. I have a 5-year-old son. We'll be homeless. That's not Mitchell Properties' concern." Patricia slid a form across the table. "Sign this acknowledging your termination and agreeing not to pursue legal action. If you don't sign, you forfeit the severance." David looked at the form. Standard legal language, the kind that protected the company and left him with nothing. He thought about Nathan, about the empty cupboards at home, about the eviction notice that would arrive any day now. He signed. Patricia took the form, stood up, and left without another word. David sat in the conference room for a long moment, staring at the expensive artwork, feeling the weight of his own powerlessness crushing him into the comfortable chair. When he finally stood up to leave, he noticed something on the table. A business card, placed face down where Patricia had been sitting. He picked it up and turned it over. "James Mitchell, CEO, Mitchell Properties." Below the name, someone had written in pen, "Don't leave the building." 42 floors above the conference room where David Chen was being terminated, James Mitchell watched the termination meeting on his office monitor. He'd had Patricia install a camera in conference room B that morning, hidden in the smoke detector. He needed to see how they'd handle it, whether his company would show any humanity at all to a man who'd committed the crime of being kind. They hadn't. James watched Patricia deliver the termination with the warmth of a tax auditor. He watched David sign the severance agreement with shaking hands. He watched a good man break apart in real time because James Mitchell's company had decided that protecting corporate liability mattered more than protecting the people who kept the building running. When David left the conference room, James made a call to security. "There's a man named David Chen in the building. He'll be leaving through the main lobby in approximately 5 minutes. Delay him. Tell him there's a problem with his severance check, something that needs his signature. Keep him in the lobby until I get there." James stood up from his desk, straightened his tie, and took the private elevator down to the ground floor. He was breaking every rule in his own company handbook, but he'd spent the last 3 days learning everything about David Chen, and the more he learned, the angrier he became. At himself, mostly, for building a company culture that punished decency, for hiring people like Glenn Morrison and Patricia Grayson who cared more about policy than people, for becoming so isolated in his wealth that he'd forgotten what actual problems looked like. The elevator opened onto the main lobby. David was standing by the security desk, confusion clear on his face as a guard explained some fabricated issue with his paperwork. James walked across the marble floor, aware of how his $1,000 shoes echoed in the vast space, aware of the way security guards straightened when they saw him coming, aware of how different his world was from David Chen's. "Mr. Chen." David turned. Recognition flickered in his eyes, then fear. He'd probably seen James in the building before, maybe knew who he was. The CEO showing up when you'd just been fired couldn't mean anything good. "I'm James Mitchell. I own this building. I'd like to speak with you, if you have a moment." David glanced at the exit, clearly wanting to run. "I already signed the termination papers." "I know. This isn't about that. Please, just 10 minutes. Something in James's tone must have registered because David nodded slowly. James led him to a small meeting room off the main lobby, closed the door, and gestured to a chair. David sat but didn't relax, shoulders tight, hands clasped in his lap. James sat across from him, trying to figure out how to explain what he'd learned over the past 3 days. "Start with the footage. Start with Ryan. I saw the security video from Friday night. You and the boy outside the building." David's face went pale. "I was just helping him." "I know." James pulled out his phone, opened a photo, and slid it across the table. "This is my son, Ryan. He died 20 years ago. He was 6 years old, got lost during a snowstorm on a family vacation. We found him 3 hours later. He'd frozen to death." David looked at the photo, then back at James, not understanding yet where this was going. "The boy you helped, the one who was freezing outside my building, he looked exactly like Ryan. Same age, same size, same dark hair. When I saw the footage, it felt like watching my son die all over again. Except this time, someone stopped to help. This time, someone gave a damn." David didn't say anything, just watched James with wary eyes. "After I saw the footage, I had our IT department pull everything we have on you. Employment records, background checks, references from your previous jobs. Then I had a private investigator spend the weekend learning everything else. Where you live, how you live, what you've been through." James watched David's expression shift from wariness to something darker. Violation of privacy, maybe. Anger at being investigated. But James pushed forward because David needed to understand the full picture. "You live in an illegally divided studio apartment in a building that should have been condemned years ago. You make $9 an hour, no benefits, no health insurance. You're a widower raising a 5-year-old son on your own. You lost your daughter 6 months ago to pneumonia because you couldn't afford urgent care. You're paying down $63,000 in medical bills from her death at $25 a month, which means you'll be paying them for the rest of your life. You sold your car to pay the electric bill. You're facing eviction. Your son's preschool tuition is 3 months overdue." David stood up abruptly. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing." James stood too. "I want to know why you gave your coat to that boy. You were wearing your only winter coat in 18-degree weather. You had to know walking home without it could kill you. Why did you do it?" David's hands were shaking. "Because he was cold. That's it. That's it. He was a kid and he was cold and I had a coat. It's not complicated." James felt something crack open in his chest, some calcified place that hadn't moved in 20 years. "You could have died. You could have left your son without a father." "I know." David's voice was quiet now. "But he looked like my daughter. The way she looked that last night when she couldn't breathe and I couldn't help her. I can't see a kid suffering and do nothing. I can't." At around word 400 in this moment of revelation, as James Mitchell began to truly understand the depth of David's sacrifice and the systemic injustice that had been inflicted on him, something shifted in the trajectory of both their lives. The truth was coming to light. But truth alone doesn't change systems without people willing to act on it and others willing to witness and amplify it. If you're invested in seeing where this story goes, if you want to know whether justice can actually prevail in a world designed to protect institutions over individuals, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment about what you're feeling right now. Subscribe to this channel because David and James's story has several more chapters and you won't want to miss what happens when power decides to use itself for good instead of protection. Share this with anyone who's ever felt crushed by systems that don't care about human suffering, anyone who's done the right thing and been punished for it. Check the description below for information about organizations fighting for workers' rights, for parents struggling to survive, for changing corporate policies that prioritize liability over humanity. This is the moment when everything could change, or when everything could stay broken. What happens next depends on whether people in positions of power choose justice over convenience, and whether the rest of us demand they do better. David couldn't have known it in that conference room, but his story was about to become something larger than one man's suffering. The silence stretched between them. Finally, James sat back down, and after a moment, David did too. "My company destroyed you for doing something good," James said. "That's on me. I built this company. I set the policies. I hired the people who decided protecting corporate liability mattered more than protecting a freezing child. That makes it my responsibility to fix." David shook his head. "You can't fix this. I'm fired. My landlord knows about the investigation. Even if you gave him my job back, he's evicting me. And once word gets out about why I was suspended, nobody's going to hire me. I'm done." "No," James said firmly. "You're not done. Not even close." He pulled out his phone and made 3 calls while David watched. The first was to Patricia Grayson. "That termination you just processed for David Chen, reverse it immediately. Is reinstated with full back pay, effective today." "What?" "No. Patricia, I don't care what policy says. I'm the CEO and I'm telling you to undo it. Do it now." The second call was to the building manager. "You have a tenant named David Chen facing eviction. What's the rent situation?" $950. "I'm wiring you 3 months' rent today." "No, not from his account, from mine personally. And I want you to inspect that apartment. If it's illegally subdivided or has any code violations, I want them fixed within a week at building expense." The third call was to his personal attorney. "I need you to review a medical debt situation. $63,000 from Children's Memorial Hospital. The debtor is David Chen. I want that debt purchased and forgiven. I don't care what it costs. Make it happen today." James hung up and looked at David, who was staring at him like he'd started speaking another language. "What are you doing?" "I'm fixing what my company broke. You gave a kid your coat and it cost you everything. That's not justice. That's cruelty disguised as policy, and I'm done with it." David's eyes were filling with tears. "Why?" "Because when I saw that footage of you helping that boy, I remembered what it felt like to be human. I've spent 20 years building an empire and using it to avoid grief. Money can't bring back my son, but maybe it can protect yours. Maybe that's the whole point." James stood up and extended his hand. "You're reinstated as of today. $9 an hour is insulting. We're moving you to 15, with full benefits including health insurance for you and Nathan. I'm paying your rent for 3 months while you get stable. Your medical debt will be gone by end of business today. And I'm going to personally call your landlord and explain that if he goes through with the eviction, I'll buy his building and make his life very difficult." David took James's hand, shook it, and then broke down completely. Full body sobs that shook his shoulders, years of held-back grief and fear and exhaustion pouring out in the small conference room. James stood there, not sure what to do, finally just putting a hand on David's shoulder and letting him cry. When David finally caught his breath, he looked up at James with red eyes. "Thank you doesn't cover this. You don't owe me thanks. You did something good and the world punished you for it. I'm just trying to make sure that doesn't happen again." James pulled a card from his wallet. "This is my personal cell number. If you need anything at all, you call me directly. No more going through Glenn Morrison or Patricia Grayson. You report directly to me now." David took the card like it was made of glass. James wasn't done. "There's one more thing. I want to find that boy you helped. The police picked him up after you went inside. I want to know what happened to him. Make sure he's safe. Will you help me with that?" David nodded. "Yes. I've been worried about him." "Good." James checked his watch. "Go home to your son. Take the rest of the day. Tomorrow, You come back to work, but not as a janitor. I need someone who actually cares about people working in my HR department. Someone who can review our policies and tell me which ones are garbage. Interested? David laughed, a sound somewhere between hysteria and joy. I don't have any HR experience. You have empathy and common sense. That makes you more qualified than anyone I currently employ. James opened the conference room door. We'll figure out the details later. Right now, go hug your kid. David left the building walking on air. But James knew the hard part was just beginning. He'd fixed David's immediate crisis, but the system that had destroyed him was still intact. Glenn Morrison was still employed. Patricia Grayson still had a job. The policies that prioritized corporate protection over human decency were still in effect. James spent the rest of that Monday afternoon firing people. Glenn Morrison first. James called him into the office, showed him the security footage, and watched him try to justify his actions. It was policy. I was following protocol. You were following your own cruelty, James said coldly. You saw a man help a freezing child and decided it was inappropriate contact. You destroyed his life to protect the company from lawsuits that were never going to happen. You're done. Clear your desk. Patricia Grayson was next. She tried to argue that she'd only been implementing standard termination procedures. Standard procedures that show zero humanity. James cut her off. David Chen is a widower with a 5-year-old son, drowning in medical debt from his daughter's death, and you terminated him for helping a child. You had all that information in his file, and you didn't care. That's not policy. That's sociopathy. Get out. By end of business Monday, James had fired 7 people in the HR and management chain. By Tuesday morning, he'd called an emergency meeting of the company's board of directors and told the Mitchell Properties was completely restructuring its employment policies. We're implementing a Good Samaritan clause, he announced. Any employee who stops to help someone in immediate danger is protected from termination or discipline, period. We're raising the minimum wage for all positions to $15 an hour. We're providing health insurance to every employee, including part-time staff. And we're creating an employee advocacy board that reports directly to me, not to HR. The board members looked at him like he'd lost his mind. One of them, a man named Richard who'd been on the board for 15 years, spoke up. James, this is going to cost millions. Shareholders aren't going to like it. I'm the majority shareholder, James said flatly. I don't care if they like it. This company has been profitable by exploiting people who do the actual work while protecting itself from any accountability. That ends today. Richard tried again, but the liability exposure from this Good Samaritan clause could be enormous. So we'll get better insurance, or we'll pay the lawsuits. I'd rather pay out liability claims than live with the knowledge that we punish decent people for being decent. James looked around the table. Anyone who has a problem with this can resign. I'll buy out your shares at market value. Otherwise, we're moving forward. No one resigned. James suspected it was because they didn't actually believe he'd follow through, that this was some temporary crisis of conscience that would fade. They were wrong. Over the next 2 weeks, James Mitchell personally reviewed every employment termination from the past year. 17 people had been fired for policy violations that, when examined, were basically punishments for being human. He reinstated 12 of them with back pay. The other 5 had found better jobs and declined to return, but he sent them compensation anyway. He hired an outside firm to audit all of Mitchell Properties' employment policies and identify which ones needed to change. The resulting report was 200 pages of documented cruelty disguised as corporate protection. James changed all of it. But while he was reforming his company, David Chen was facing a different kind of resistance. The apartment building where he lived, the landlord Frank had spread word about why David had been suspended. The neighbors who'd been friendly before now avoided him. Parents pulled their children inside when David walked past with Nathan. One morning, someone spray-painted pervert on David's door. David scrubbed it off before Nathan could see it, but the damage was done. The building had decided he was guilty, and no amount of explanation would change their minds. Even Mrs. Park, who'd watched Nathan for months, started making excuses why she couldn't help anymore. James found out about it when David called him, voice shaking, to explain why he might need to move anyway. I'll handle it, James said. Give me one day. That afternoon, James showed up at David's building with a lawyer, the building inspector, and a camera crew from a local news station. He'd decided that if the court of public opinion had convicted David Chen, then the court of public opinion needed to see the truth. The news story ran that night. James Mitchell, billionaire CEO, explaining how his company had nearly destroyed a good man for helping a freezing child. Security footage of David taking off his coat in the snow. Interviews with David, with Nathan, with the police officers who'd picked up the boy. And at the center of it all, James Mitchell saying directly to the camera, David Chen is a hero. Anyone who thinks otherwise is welcome to come argue with me personally. The story went viral. By the next morning, it had been picked up by national news. By afternoon, it was trending on social media. The spray-painted slur on David's door became a symbol of everything wrong with how society treats people who help others. Frank, the landlord, called James in a panic. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know the whole story. You didn't care, James corrected. You heard part of the story and decided it was enough to condemn a man. Now everyone knows your name and what you did. How does it feel? Frank had no answer. Within a week, David had more support than he knew what to do with. People sent money, sent gifts for Nathan, sent job offers and apartment offers and offers to help however they could. The spray-painted door became a place where neighbors left apology notes and flowers. But the person James and David most wanted to find remained missing. The boy David had helped, the one who'd been taken away by police that night, seemed to have vanished into the system. The police department had no record of where he'd ended up. Child Services claimed privacy laws prevented them from sharing information. James Mitchell, who'd spent 20 years learning how to use wealth and power to get what he wanted, had finally found something money couldn't immediately buy: information about a child lost in the foster system. It took him 3 more weeks and the help of 2 different lawyers to finally track down what happened to the boy David had saved. When he learned the truth, James knew the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The boy's name was Michael Torres. 7 years old, not 6 like James had thought. He'd been living on the streets with his mother for 8 months after they'd been evicted from their apartment. The night David found him, his mother had been at the emergency room with severe pneumonia. She'd left Michael outside the building because she was afraid Child Services would take him if they saw her bring a child into the ER with no fixed address. She'd been right to worry. By the time she got out of the hospital 3 days later, Michael was in foster care and she'd been charged with child endangerment and neglect. The state had terminated her parental rights while she was still recovering. Michael had been placed with a foster family on the south side, 40 minutes from his mother, from his school, from everything he'd ever known. James learned all of this from his lawyers, who'd had to file Freedom of Information requests and threaten legal action to get even basic information from Child Services. When he finally got Michael's case file, he spent 3 hours reading it in his office, door locked, and by the end he understood exactly why the system was broken. Michael's mother, Rosa Torres, was 32 years old. She'd been working 2 jobs before the eviction, 60 hours a week, trying to keep them housed. She'd lost both jobs when she had to be hospitalized with pneumonia. Without income, without housing, without support, she'd done her best to keep Michael safe and fed while living in her car. The state had decided this made her an unfit parent. James called David that evening. I found the boy. His name is Michael Torres. He's in foster care and his mother's rights were terminated. We need to fix this. How? David's voice was cautious. The state doesn't usually reverse those decisions. The state is going to make an exception. James had already started planning. Tomorrow morning, you and I are going to visit Michael. Then we're going to visit his mother. Then we're going to talk to every judge, every social worker, every bureaucrat necessary to fix what they broke. They started with Michael. The foster home was a small house in a neighborhood that had seen better days, but it was clean and the foster mother who answered the door seemed kind of overwhelmed. She had 4 other kids placed with her, all under 10. You'll hear about Michael. She looked between James and David, clearly confused why a man in a $1,000 suit and a man in Goodwill clothes were standing on her porch together. We are. James kept his voice gentle. We're trying to help reunite him with his mother. Could we speak with him? The foster mother hesitated. His caseworker didn't mention any visitors. His caseworker doesn't know we're coming. James handed her his business card. I'm James Mitchell. I own Mitchell Properties. This is David Chen. He's the man who saved Michael's life 3 weeks ago. We just want 5 minutes. She studied the card, studied them, then opened the door wider. 5 minutes. He's in the living room. Michael was sitting on a worn couch, watching cartoons with 2 other foster children. He was small for 7, thin in a way that spoke of chronic hunger rather than genetics. The coat David had given him was folded neatly on the arm of the couch. He'd kept it. David walked over slowly, not wanting to scare him. Hey, Michael, do you remember me? Michael looked up, eyes widening. You're the coat man. Yeah, I'm the coat man. My name is David. This is my friend James. We've been looking for you. Why? Michael's voice was so quiet they could barely hear him. Because I wanted to make sure you were okay. Are you okay? Michael glanced at the foster mother, then back at David. I want my mom. The 3 words broke something in David. James saw it happen, saw David's face crumple before he got it under control. I know, buddy. We're working on that. The lady from the state said I can't see her. Michael's eyes were filling with tears. She said my mom did bad things and I have to stay here now. James knelt down to Michael's level. Your mom didn't do bad things. She got sick and couldn't take care of you for a little while. But that doesn't mean she doesn't love you. We're going to fix this. You promise? Michael looked at James with the kind of hope that could destroy you if you let it down. I promise. It might take a little time, but we're going to fix it. They left the foster home 15 minutes later with Michael's case file information and the knowledge that if they failed, they'd be breaking a promise to a 7-year-old who'd already been failed by every system that was supposed to protect him. Rosa Torres was living in a women's shelter on the west side. James and David found her there that afternoon, in a shared room with 6 beds and no privacy. She was working on a laptop at a communal table, applying for jobs. When they introduced themselves and explained why they were there, she started crying. They won't let me see him. I've been calling every day and they keep saying it's not a good time. He needs to adjust. I can't disrupt his placement. He's my baby and they took him because I got sick. Tell me what happened, James said. All of it. Rosa told them about the eviction, about trying to find shelter while keeping Michael in school, about getting so sick she couldn't breathe but being terrified to go to the hospital because she didn't have insurance and didn't know what would happen to Michael, about leaving him by the heating vent where at least he'd be warm, planning to come back as soon as the ER released her. I left him for 3 hours. 3 hours. And they called it abandonment and neglect. David leaned forward. You didn't abandon him. You kept him safe while you were getting help. That's good parenting. Try telling that to child services. Rosa wiped her eyes. I have a court date next month to appeal the termination, but my public defender says I shouldn't get my hopes up. Once the state decides you're unfit, they don't usually change their mind. James pulled out his phone. Your public defender is fired. I'm hiring you a family law attorney, one of the best in the state. We're going to that court date and we're getting your son back. Rosa stared at him. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Because David gave up his coat to save your son, and it cost him everything. Now I'm in a position to help make sure Michael doesn't lose his mother over a system that punishes people for being poor. Let me help. Over the next 3 weeks, James Mitchell learned exactly how difficult it is to reverse a termination of parental rights, even when you have unlimited resources and the best lawyers money can buy. The system was designed to protect children, but somewhere along the way it had started operating on the assumption that poverty equaled unfitness and any parent who struggled was a threat to their child. Rosa's case wasn't unique. James started digging into child services data and found hundreds of cases just like hers. Parents who'd lost custody because they couldn't afford housing, because they'd gotten sick without insurance, because they'd made one mistake during the worst moment of their lives. Michael Torres's caseworker, a woman named Janet Reeves, refused to support reunification. In her opinion, Rosa had demonstrated poor judgment and Michael was better off in foster care. Never mind that Michael cried himself to sleep every night asking for his mother. Never mind that Rosa had never hurt him, never neglected him except for 3 hours when she was literally fighting for her life in an emergency room. The system had decided, and the system rarely admitted mistakes. At around word 650 into this battle against institutional inertia, as James and David fought against a system designed to separate families rather than support them, both men began to understand that individual wealth and goodwill weren't enough. The story of Michael and Rosa Torres represented thousands of families trapped in the same nightmare, and unless people witnessed what was happening and demanded change, the cycle would continue forever. If you're feeling the weight of this injustice, if you're angry about a system that punishes poverty and separates families over circumstances beyond their control, take a moment to like this video and leave a comment about whether you think the system can actually change. Subscribe to this channel because the fight for Michael and Rosa isn't over, and you'll want to see whether standing together can actually overcome institutional resistance. Share this story with anyone who's been affected by child services, by poverty, by systems that claim to help but actually hurt. Check the description for organizations fighting for family reunification rights, for supporting parents in crisis, for changing policies that prioritize separation over support. This is the moment when individual action meets systemic resistance, when we find out whether money and influence can overcome bureaucratic inertia or whether the system is too broken to fix. David and James couldn't fight this battle alone. They needed witnesses. They needed pressure. They needed people to care enough to demand better. And Michael needed his mother. James hired 3 different law firms to work on Rosa's case. They filed motions, requested hearings, compiled evidence of Rosa's stable housing situation at the shelter, her active job search, her clean drug tests, her completion of every parenting class the state required. They interviewed Michael's teachers, who all said he was a good kid with a loving mother who'd always been involved in his education until circumstances made it impossible. Nothing moved the needle. Janet Reeves, the caseworker, filed a response opposing reunification. Her reasoning was simple. Rosa Torres had made a choice to leave her 7-year-old son alone on the street at night in 18-degree weather. This demonstrated a fundamental inability to prioritize her child's safety. The fact that she'd done it while seeking medical care for a potentially fatal illness was, in Janet's opinion, irrelevant. James read the response in his office and put his fist through the wall. David was more practical. We need to go over her head, find out who supervises Janet Reeves, and make them see reason. That led them to Margaret Chen, no relation to David, director of child services for the county. Margaret agreed to meet with them, which James took as a good sign until the meeting actually happened, and he realized Margaret was even more rigid than Janet. "I understand your concerns," Margaret said with the kind of patient condescension that made James want to throw things. "But we have to look at outcomes, not intentions. Ms. Torres' son was found alone on a street in dangerous weather. Whether she had good reasons doesn't change that fact. The fact," David said quietly, "is that Michael had been safe for months while Rosa kept him fed and sheltered despite having nothing. One night, when she was dying of pneumonia, she made sure he was by a heat vent and went to get medical care so she could keep being his mother. And you punished her for it. We don't punish people, Mr. Chen. We protect children. You separated a child from his mother because she was poor. That's punishment." David's voice was rising. "You didn't offer her help. You didn't give her resources. You just took her kid and called it protection." Margaret's expression hardened. "This meeting is over. Ms. Torres will have her day in court. Until then, Michael stays in foster care." They left the child services building with the understanding that they were going to have to fight this in court, in public, and probably both. James called a press conference. He did it from the steps of the child services building, with David and Rosa beside him, with Michael's elementary school photo blown up on a poster board behind them. Every major news outlet in the city showed up because James Mitchell didn't do press conferences, and when he did, it was news. 3 weeks ago, James told the cameras, a janitor named David Chen saved a 7-year-old boy from freezing to death. The boy's name is Michael Torres. His mother, Rosa, was in the emergency room fighting pneumonia. She'd left Michael by a heating vent for 3 hours while she got medical care that would keep her alive to raise him. Child Services decided this was neglect. They took Michael away and terminated Rosa's parental rights. Today, I'm here to tell Child Services and anyone else listening that what they did was wrong, and we're going to fight it until Michael is back with his mother where he belongs. Rosa spoke next, her voice shaking but clear. I love my son more than anything in this world. I made sure he was safe while I got help. That's not neglect. That's survival. And if child services cared about protecting children, they'd be helping families stay together instead of tearing them apart. David spoke last. I gave up my coat for Michael because he was cold and I couldn't walk past a child who needed help. Now we're asking everyone watching to not walk past this family who needs help. Call child services. Call your representatives. Tell them this is wrong. Tell them families shouldn't be separated because of poverty. The press conference aired on every channel. It trended on social media. Within 24 hours, Child Services had received over 10,000 calls and emails demanding they reunite Michael with his mother. Janet Reeves filed a complaint claiming James Mitchell was interfering with an active case and harassing state employees. James's lawyers filed a countersuit claiming the state had violated Rosa Torres's constitutional rights. The whole mess landed on the desk of a family court judge named Maria Gonzalez, who scheduled an emergency hearing to sort it out. Judge Gonzalez was known for being tough but fair, which James hoped meant she'd actually look at the evidence rather than just rubber-stamping child services decisions like most judges did. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning, 2 weeks after the press conference. James hired a child psychologist to evaluate Michael and testify about the trauma of separating children from fit parents. He hired an expert on homelessness to testify about the impossible choices parents face when they have no resources. He compiled data on how many families in the county had been separated for reasons related to poverty rather than abuse. Child Services brought Janet Reeves and Margaret Chen to defend their decision. They brought their own experts to talk about the risks of allowing children to remain with parents who demonstrated questionable judgment. The hearing lasted 6 hours. Michael wasn't there, but his absence was felt in every testimony, every argument, every moment. A 7-year-old boy who wanted his mother, separated by a system that claimed to be protecting him. Judge Gonzalez listened to everything, asked pointed questions of both sides, and finally called a recess to review the evidence. She came back an hour later looking tired. This case represents a fundamental problem with how we approach child welfare in this country. We've created a system where being poor is treated as evidence of unfitness, where parents who are struggling get punishment instead of support. Ms. Torres made a choice in an impossible situation. She needed medical care to stay alive for her son. She made sure he was in the safest place she could manage and then got that care. Some might call that neglect. I call it survival. Janet Reeves started to object, but Judge Gonzalez held up her hand. However, I'm bound by law and precedent. Ms. Torres did leave her child unattended in dangerous conditions. Whether her reasons were good doesn't change that fact. The termination of her parental rights was within the bounds of the law, even if I personally find it unjust. Rosa made a sound like she'd been hit. David grabbed her hand. Therefore, Judge Gonzalez continued, I'm ordering a 6-month reunification plan. Ms. Torres will complete parenting classes, maintain stable housing, and demonstrate consistent employment. During this time, she'll have supervised visits with Michael twice a week. If she successfully completes the plan, I will reverse the termination and restore full custody. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. A chance. Thank you, Rosa whispered. Judge Gonzalez looked directly at her. Don't thank me. Thank Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Chen for fighting when most people would have given up. And Ms. Torres, I'm going to be watching your case personally. If Child Services tries to sabotage your reunification, I want to know about it immediately. Margaret Chen looked like she'd swallowed glass. They left the courthouse in a complicated state of relief and frustration. 6 months was a long time for a 7-year-old, but it was better than never. James wasn't satisfied. He spent the next month researching child welfare policy, talking to advocates, understanding the scope of the problem. What he learned made him furious all over again. Thousands of families separated not because of abuse but because of poverty. Children in foster care who'd been taken from loving parents who just needed help, not judgment. He started a foundation, the Rosa Torres Family Preservation Fund. Initial funding of $10 million to provide legal support, housing assistance, and resources to families facing separation by child services. He hired advocates, lawyers, social workers who actually cared about keeping families together. And he started pushing for policy change at the state level. Bills that would require child services to offer support before considering removal. Bills that would mandate judicial review of all termination decisions. Bills that would hold caseworkers accountable for separating families without cause. It was a long fight. But James Mitchell had learned that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. Chapter 5. The Truth and New Beginning. The state legislature hearing room was packed. Representatives from child services, foster care advocacy groups, family preservation organizations, and dozens of parents who'd been through the system filled every seat. James Mitchell sat in the front row next to David Chen and Rosa Torres, watching 3 state senators review the proposed Family Preservation Act. It had taken 4 months to get the bill this far. 4 months of lobbying, of sharing Rosa's story, of compiling data showing how many families had been unnecessarily separated. 4 months of fighting against institutional resistance from child services, from foster care organizations that receive funding for every child placed, from politicians who were afraid of being accused of leaving children in dangerous situations. But the hearing was happening, which meant they had a chance. Senator Williams, who'd sponsored the bill, spoke first. The Family Preservation Act would require child services to offer concrete support to families before removing children for reasons related to poverty. Housing assistance, medical care, job placement, child key support. Removal would be a last resort, not a first response. Margaret Chen stood to testify against the bill. Her argument was predictable. Child safety must come first. Poverty often masks deeper dysfunction. The state can't take risks with children's lives. Then Rosa Torres took the stand. My name is Rosa Torres. 4 months ago, the state took my 7-year-old son because I left him by a heating vent for 3 hours while I fought for my life in an emergency room. They called it neglect. I call it trying to survive so I could keep being his mother. Child services never offered me help. They never asked if I needed housing or medical care or support. They just took my baby and called it protection. Rosa's voice broke, but she pushed through. Michael cries every night asking to come home. He's 7 years old, and his mother loves him, and he's in a stranger's house because being poor is treated like a crime in this state. This bill wouldn't let that happen to the next family. It would require help instead of punishment. Please pass it. David testified next, talking about what he'd seen as a single father struggling to keep his own son safe, about the impossible choices poverty forces parents to make. Then James spoke, using his platform and his wealth to give weight to what Rosa and David had said. I've spent the last 4 months learning about our child welfare system. What I've found is that we've built a machine designed to separate families, not support them. Thousands of children removed from loving parents not because of abuse but because of poverty. We can do better. We must do better. This bill is a start. The hearing lasted 3 hours. At the end, Senator Williams called for a vote. The bill passed the committee, 5 votes to 2. It wasn't law yet. It still had to pass the full legislature, had to survive opposition from entrenched interests, had to make it through months more of political process. But it was moving forward. Rosa cried on the courthouse steps. We did it. We actually did it. We started it, James corrected gently. There's still work to do. But that work got easier 2 weeks later when Judge Gonzalez ruled that Rosa had successfully completed her reunification plan. 5 months instead of 6, because Michael's therapist testified that the separation was causing serious harm and Rosa had exceeded every requirement. The day Michael came home was a Thursday. James and David were both there, along with half a dozen news cameras because the story had become bigger than one family. It had become a symbol of what could change when people fought back against broken systems. Michael ran to Rosa the moment he saw her, 7 years old and small for his age, but strong enough to nearly knock her over with the force of his hug. Rosa held him and sobbed, 5 months of separation breaking apart into relief and joy. David watched with tears in his eyes, thinking about Emma, about how she'd never get to grow up, but maybe her death had led to this moment. To Michael being saved, to families being protected. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. James watched and thought about Ryan, about the son he'd lost 20 years ago, about how grief could either destroy you or push you to make sure the world was better for someone else's child. He'd chosen the latter, finally, after 2 decades of choosing nothing at all. A reporter asked Michael how it felt to be home. He looked at the camera with serious dark eyes and said, "I want to say thank you to the coat man. He saved me." David knelt down to Michael's level. "You don't need to thank me, buddy. I'm just glad you're okay. Can I keep the coat?" "Of course you can keep the coat." Michael smiled, the first real smile any of them had seen from him in months. That night, James invited David, Rosa, and Michael to dinner at his home. Not the penthouse downtown, but his actual house in the suburbs, the one he rarely used because it had too many memories of Ryan and the family he'd lost. It was time to make new memories. They ate pizza because that's what Michael wanted, sitting in James's living room that was too big and too empty but felt less empty with people in it. Nathan came too, David's 5-year-old son who'd been through his own struggles and now had enough to eat and health insurance and a father who wasn't drowning anymore. The 2 boys played together while the adults talked about the future. Rosa had a job at Mitchell Properties now, working in community outreach at a salary that let her rent a real apartment. David was running the company's new employee advocacy program, making sure no one else got destroyed for showing kindness. James had discovered that using his wealth to help people was more satisfying than using it to build empires. The foundation was growing, helping more families, pushing for more policy changes. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was something. At around word 850 in this new chapter of their intertwined lives, as they sat together in James's living room watching 2 boys play and laugh with the ease of childhood, all 3 adults understood that individual stories of redemption and rescue were beautiful but insufficient. The systems that had nearly destroyed them were still destroying other families. The work of changing those systems required more than one wealthy benefactor and one viral news story. It required sustained attention, collective action, and people willing to care about families they'd never meet. If this story has moved you, if you've seen yourself or your family in the struggles of Rosa and David and Michael, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment sharing your own experiences or thoughts about how we can support families in crisis. Subscribe to this channel because stories like this deserve to be told and heard. Because visibility creates accountability. Because systems change when enough people demand they change. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear a story about redemption. About what happens when ordinary people fight back against institutional cruelty with extraordinary courage. Check the description below for links to family preservation organizations, to advocacy groups fighting for policy change, to resources for parents facing separation from their children. The real work happens when we move from witnessing individual suffering to demanding collective change. Rosa, David, and Michael's story had a happy ending, but thousands of families are still trapped in the nightmare they escaped. The question isn't whether their story matters. It's whether we'll let it matter enough to actually change the systems that create these nightmares in the first place. That's the work that continues long after the cameras stop rolling and the news cycle moves on. 3 months later, the Family Preservation Act passed the state legislature and was signed into law. Child Services was required to offer concrete support before considering removal. Judicial oversight was mandated for all termination decisions. Families started receiving help instead of punishment. It wasn't perfect. Some kids still fell through cracks. Some caseworkers still operated from bias. Some families still got separated when they shouldn't have been. But it was better. Measurably, documentably better. James started working on similar legislation in other states. David traveled to speak at conferences about employee rights and corporate responsibility. Rosa became an advocate for homeless families, using her experience to help others navigate the system. And Michael grew up knowing he was loved, knowing that strangers had fought for him, knowing that his mother had never stopped trying to bring him home. On the first anniversary of the night David gave up his coat, James organized a small ceremony at Mitchell Properties. They unveiled a plaque in the lobby, the David Chen Compassion Award, established in honor of an employee who sacrificed his own comfort to save a child's life and taught us all that kindness matters more than policy. Every year, the award would go to an employee who showed exceptional compassion, who helped someone in need, who demonstrated that humanity was more important than protecting corporate interests. The recipient would receive a $10,000 grant to donate to a charity of their choice. David stood next to the plaque, uncomfortable with the attention but understanding why it mattered. "I didn't do anything special. I just gave a kid my coat." "You gave him more than that," James said. "You gave him his life. You gave Rosa her son back. You gave all of us a chance to be better than we were." Rosa held Michael's hand and added, "You didn't just save my son that night. You saved our whole family. You changed everything." The ceremony ended with cake and awkward small talk, people congratulating David while he tried to deflect attention. But James noticed how David kept looking at the plaque, at his own name engraved in metal, permanent proof that he mattered, that his actions had created ripples that changed lives. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, James found David sitting alone in the lobby staring at the plaque. "You okay?" David looked up, eyes bright. "A year ago, I was scrubbing toilets for $9 an hour with no health insurance and no hope. I thought helping Michael would cost me everything. Instead, it gave me everything I'd lost. A stable job, the ability to take care of Nathan. Purpose. How did that happen?" James sat down next to him. "It happened because you were kind when kindness cost you. Because you saw a child suffering and chose to help even though helping hurt you. The world needs more people like you, David. That's why I'm trying to build systems that protect people like you instead of destroying them." "You think we actually changed anything? Beyond our own lives?" "I know we did. The Family Preservation Act alone will keep hundreds of families together. Your advocacy work has changed employment policies at companies across the state. Rosa's outreach has helped dozens of homeless families get housing and support. We can't fix everything, but we fix some things. That matters." David was quiet for a moment, then said, "Emma would have liked this. She always wanted to help people. When she was 5, she tried to give a lunch to a kid at school who didn't have one. The teacher called me because Emma wasn't eating, and when I asked her why, she said the other kid was hungry, so she gave him her sandwich. She got in trouble for breaking school policy about sharing food. Sounds like she learned compassion from her father. Well, I learned it from her." David wiped his eyes. "I miss her every day, but knowing that her death led to me helping Michael, that the medical debt from losing her eventually connected me to you and to changing the system that killed her, I don't know. It doesn't make it hurt less, but it makes it mean something." James understood. Ryan's death had destroyed him for 20 years, but helping Michael had finally given that loss some purpose. The grief didn't disappear, but it transformed into something that could create good instead of just creating pain. They sat in the lobby of Mitchell Properties, two men who'd been broken by loss and rebuilt by choosing to help others, watching the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows and thinking about the families they'd saved and the work still left to do. 6 months later, David married a woman named Karen who worked in accounting at Mitchell Properties. They'd met when she'd come to thank him for the advocacy program, which had helped her get accommodations for a disability her previous employer had refused to provide. Nathan was the ring bearer. Michael and Rosa were invited. James gave a toast about how love and kindness create ripples that change everything. Rosa finished her degree and became a social worker, specializing in helping families navigate child services. She knew every loophole, every policy, every way to fight back against a system designed to separate instead of support. Michael thrived in school, made friends, played soccer, grew up secure in the knowledge that he was loved and safe. James never remarried, never had more children, but he filled his life with purpose instead of emptiness. The foundation grew. The policy changes spread to more states. The stories of families helped multiplied. Ryan's room in his house stayed the same, but James opened the rest of the house to the people who mattered. David's family, Rosa and Michael, the employees who'd become friends, the advocates who'd become partners in change. 3 years after the night David gave up his coat, James was diagnosed with cancer. Stage 4, aggressive, the kind that doesn't respond well to treatment. He had maybe a year, the doctors said. Maybe less. He called David immediately. "I need you to do something for me. When I'm gone, I want you to run the foundation. You understand what families need because you've lived it. Promise me you'll keep fighting." David promised. James spent his last months making sure everything was in place. The foundation would be funded in perpetuity from his estate. David would be CEO with full authority to direct the work. Rosa would be on the board. Michael's college education was paid for in full. He died on a Tuesday, surrounded by the people he'd chosen as family. David held his hand. Rosa told stories about families they'd saved. Michael, now 10 years old, read a letter he'd written thanking James for everything. The funeral was packed. Employees, advocates, families who'd been helped, politicians who'd been pushed to change laws. They all came to honor a man who'd spent the first half of his life building an empire and the second half tearing down the walls between people. David gave the eulogy. He talked about a janitor and a CEO who'd both been broken by loss, who'd found purpose in helping others, who'd proven that kindness could change systems if you refused to let the systems crush kindness. He talked about a 7-year-old boy who'd been saved by a coat and how that single act of compassion had rippled out to transform hundreds of lives. James Mitchell taught me that wealth isn't about what you have, it's about what you do with it. That power isn't about control. It's about using your influence to protect people who have none. That grief can either destroy you or drive you to make sure others don't suffer the same loss. He chose the latter. We're all better because he did. The foundation continued after James died. David ran it with the same compassion and practical wisdom he'd brought to every challenge in his life. The family preservation work expanded to a dozen states. Employment protection policies spread to hundreds of companies. The work James had started continued, growing, reaching more people, changing more systems. Michael Torres graduated high school at the top of his class, got a full scholarship to college, and decided to become a child welfare attorney. He wanted to fight for kids like he'd been, for parents like his mother, for the families still trapped in systems that punished poverty. Rosa cried when he told her his decision. Your father would be so proud. James wasn't my father, Michael said gently. But he saved my family, and David saved my life. So I'm going to spend my life saving other families and other lives. That's how you honor the people who helped you. On the 10th anniversary of the night David gave up his coat, they gathered at Mitchell Properties for a memorial ceremony. The David Chen Compassion Award had helped dozens of employees over the years. The Rosa Torres Family Preservation Fund had kept hundreds of families together. The policy changes they'd fought for had spread across the country. Nathan, now 15, stood with his father and stepmother and watched Michael give a speech about the importance of kindness in a world designed to punish it. Rosa stood nearby, older now but still fighting for families. James's legacy lived in every person in the room, every family that hadn't been separated, every system that had changed. David looked around the lobby at the people gathered, at the plaque with his name that he still didn't quite believe he deserved, at the life he'd built from the ruins of giving up his coat one snowy night. He thought about Emma, about Lisa, about every loss that had led him to that moment when he'd seen a freezing child and decided to help regardless of cost. He thought about James, about how a billionaire's grief had transformed into purpose. He thought about Rosa and Michael, about how their suffering had become a catalyst for change that helped thousands of families they'd never meet. The world was still broken in so many ways. Poverty still existed. Families still struggled. Systems still crushed people who deserved help instead of punishment. But they made it slightly less broken. They'd fought back and won some battles even if the war continued. That mattered. Standing in the lobby of Mitchell Properties, surrounded by people who'd chosen kindness over convenience and compassion over policy, David Chen understood that giving up his coat 10 years ago had been the most important thing he'd ever done. Not because it saved one boy, though it had. Not because it changed his own life, though it had. But because it proved that ordinary people doing ordinary acts of kindness could shift the entire trajectory of other lives if they refused to be crushed by systems designed to punish goodness. The ceremony ended with a moment of silence for James, then cake and conversation and the comfortable noise of people who cared about each other being together. David stood near the plaque with his name and watched his son laugh with Michael, watched Rosa hug people she'd helped, watched the ripples continue spreading outward from a single act of compassion on a snowy night. This is what matters, he thought. Not the systems that try to destroy us. Not the policies that punish kindness. not the fear that stops most people from helping. What matters is choosing to be kind anyway, choosing to help even when helping costs you, choosing to believe that one person giving up their coat to save a freezing child can change the world if enough people decide to care. He was right. The world changed because David Chen decided a child's life mattered more than his own comfort. Because James Mitchell decided wealth meant nothing if it didn't help people. Because Rosa Torres refused to give up on her son. Because Michael Torres grew up determined to help others the way he'd been helped. Because sometimes, on a snowy night when the temperature drops to 18 degrees and a 7-year-old boy huddles by a heating vent trying to stay alive, someone stops. Someone gives up their coat. Someone decides that kindness matters more than rules. And everything changes.